Welcome back, all of our viewers on the UK Column live stream, at ukcolumn.org, but also on rumble.com as well. Thank you for joining us for Section 2, the 9/11 Wars and Beyond. We'll be hearing two presentations during this session, and the first is Professor Jeremy Keenan. The title of his presentation will be Creating a Second Front in the War on Terror, Its Consequences for the Sahara and Sahel region. And Professor Jeremy Keenan is a social anthropologist who has worked with and on the people of the Sahara since the 1960s. He is currently visiting professor in the law school at Queen Mary University in London, researching and writing on state crime. He has written more on the Sahara than anyone else in its history, including some 350 academic books and articles. And since 2002 to the present, he was researched in minute detail the GWOT, the Global War on Terror in North Africa, and its consequences on the people in that region, most notably, again, in the Sahara and Sahel regions. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the symposium Professor Jeremy Keenan.
Thank you, Pat, for those kind words. As we know, the US response to 9/11 was to launch its global war on terror, initially by invading Afghanistan, then Iraq. However, almost simultaneously, the US opened a second front in the Sahara Sahel. The Sahel is the bottom southern part of the Sahara, if you like, referred to generally as the Sahara Front. The official version of that front, or the official version of the front, is really wholly propaganda. It's largely fake news. And this propaganda, as it mostly is, has been largely accepted as the truth. And one reason for that is basically because no one other than myself has been able to work in the region and to monitor what has been happening there, literally from day one to the present. Now, the first action in this region was in late 2002, then it moved into 2003, pretty much at the same time as the beginning of the invasion of Iraq. Shortly after it began there, I wrote on several occasions at the time that this could lead to a nationwide conflagration. 20 years later, that's today, that is what has happened. What we now tend to call the war in the Sahel, what Obama began to call the long war, a word or a phrase that didn't really have legs and hasn't been heard of much since then. This war in the Sahel, and this first slide that's up there shows the countries of the Sahel running across from Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, and across into Sudan. That sort of war began in Mali in 2013. The idea, the motive then was to rid Mali of so-called terrorists, Islamist extremists, jihadists, and that particular war has now been going on for over 8 years, be 9 years this coming January. And the first slide, which you've got up there, is the map of the Sahel, which shows those countries. Since 2013, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 civilians, quite possibly more, have been killed, mostly in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and to some extent in Chad. I exclude from those figures killings by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, which is a slightly different sector of operations. Today, this war in the Sahel is simply just not seen by the mainstream media as a consequence of 9/11 and the initial global war on terror. So my aim here now is to explain how 9/11 led to this second front in the global war on terror, and then how it metastasized, and I think that's really the right word for it, into what we now call the Sahel War. And this is currently, what I'm talking about now is currently being written up in two detailed publications which will be made available to the group through its website. The first is working title, Report on the War on Terror in North Africa from 2002 to 2022, that's now, the consequences for the peoples of the Sahara and Sahel. And this will be published through the International State Crime Initiative, which is housed in the law school at Queen Mary University, London. The second document is a book, the third of a trilogy I've written on terrorism in the Sahara, working title, War in the Sahel. And this will be published in the State Crime series, probably by Routledge. It may go with Pluto, but that's still being discussed. So right now, I just want to draw attention to 6 points. The first is that we can really see this 20 years of war in North Africa, the Sahara and the Sahel, in 2 phases. The first phase from the beginning, 2002-3, up until the end of 2011. And that date, 2011, is key. That is the ousting of Gaddafi in Libya, the Libyan revolution. So Libya plays a pertinent part in this sort of transformation. The second phase is from that point, that's the beginning of 2013, to the present. Okay, second point is referring to phase 1, these first 10 years or so. This began as an alliance between the United States and Algeria. So what I will first do is explain the motives of these 2 countries. Why did these 2 countries literally get into bed together? The Algerian motive at the time, it needed to re-equip its army with weaponry after the 1990s. That is a civil war, the dark years of the 1990s. And in short, it needed American help also to sort of get itself back into the world scene and get a seat sitting at the feet of those on the high table, if you like. So in other words, Algeria needed the US. And I should say that prior to 9/11, literally in the few months before that, Algeria and America were talking at a very high level of precisely this possibility of getting arms, re-equipment of the army from Algeria and so forth. On the day of 9/11, the head of the Algerian intelligence services was actually in the Pentagon discussing this when 9/11 occurred. So from the American point of view, there are really 3 motives from the American side. The first, these are in chronological order almost. The first, and initially, was an energy crisis. In 1996, American imports of energy surpassed 50% for the first time in the country's history. This was psychologically critical. And the first executive action of George Bush when he took the presidency was to order Dick Cheney to write a report on the energy crisis. Known as the Cheney Report, that was published in May 2001. It wasn't widely read, of course, because it was drowned out very shortly afterwards by 9/11, but it was the key sort of driving document in the Bush administration at that time. The conclusions of that report were that America's main source of energy at that time, actually, and certainly going into the future, oil, this is imported oil, was coming from West Africa, mostly in the Gulf of West Africa, and from Nigeria in particular. Thus, if this part of Africa was going to become critical for the future of America, it needed to be militarized. Basically, that oil needed to be secured as a national resource. So the first problem America had is, how could it do that? And the answer, well, was through the global war on terror, which sounded good, but that was a problem because there was no real terror or terrorism as we know it in the 9/11 sort of sense in that part of Africa. So the solution to that was to fabricate it. And they did this with their alliance with Algeria, particularly the intelligence services of Algeria. Known, the acronym is the DRS. I won't give you the full name, it's the DRS. So America, with the DRS, began fabricating terrorism. They fabricated the grounds for the launch of the global war on terror into the region in 2002, and then in fact in 2002 they botched it. They tried again, they got it going in 2003. The key role of the DRS, the Algerian Secret Services, in all of this was that during the 1990s it had infiltrated its own terrorist groups, the Groupe Salafiste pour la Prédication de la Combat, GSPC, a rather mouthful of words. And that terrorist group, numbering maybe about 600, operating in northern Algeria, was effectively being led by DRS infiltrators. So most of the terrorist incidents in this first period were fabricated. We see a lot of false flag operations, particularly events that never even happened, just literally made up, fiction stories, and a lot of fake news, particularly about bin Laden's men in the Sahara. We have the Pentagon at the highest levels talking literally about 30,000 so-called terrorists fleeing from the American invasion in Afghanistan, crossing through the Sahel region. You can see it on the map there, sort of the under part of the Sahara, coming up into North Africa and posing a threat to Europe. So we have a huge amount of hyperbole and extraordinary language. The Pentagon talking about draining the swamp. The Sahara they called a swamp, which is kind of maybe a typical Pentagon type of analogy. This had to be drained. And this was the talk. Headlines, I literally downloaded something like about 6,000 news items during this period. Then I lost count, and there wasn't much point. If you could have slide 2 there, please. Okay, a group of the GSPC, the so-called terrorists. I have dozens of these photographs. They literally stood around posing, which is not very typical for normal bona fide terrorists. But those ones there are being led by the Algerian DRS, and the foot soldiers, as I call them, were genuine Salafists. They were, literally genuine jihadists, but being led by infiltrated officers from the Algerian secret services. This fabricated terrorism, not that there was much happened then, it was mostly kidnapping of Western tourists in the area, but it was enough to justify the launch of Bush's what he called the Pan-Sahel initiative in 2004. This was the invasion, as the local people called it, by 1,000 or so American troops, mostly contractors, into Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and Chad. Followed the following year, 2005, by what the Americans called the Trans-Saharan Counter-Terrorism Initiative, which was this linked the whole region, 9 countries of North Africa right down to Nigeria, in a security arrangement whose architecture was uniquely American. So the first motive of the United States was to provide the militarization of Africa, if needed, to secure oil resources. The second motive really only began about 2006, when the Pentagon, generals in the Pentagon started thinking of the idea of creating a new American command uniquely for Africa, what became called US AFRICOM. And this was meeting a lot of political resistance in Congress and elsewhere. So to justify it, they needed to literally ramp up terrorism in the region, which had rather sort of died down. There wasn't much more of it. So they had to revamp terrorism again, sort of reboot it, if you like, which they started doing in 2006. And in a covert operation, there's several operations, but the main one was American troops flown from Europe secretly right down to the Algerian Mali border. There they paid local DRS agents working with local Tuareg a lot of money to start up a rebellion in Kidal in northern Mali. It lasted one day. It was sort of overseen by the Algerian secret services. Only 4 people died. It was a lot of bluster, a lot of noise, a lot of propaganda, a lot of news headlines, but not much action on the ground, as was designed. And this was followed up by contrived attacks on so-called terrorists up in the desert north of Timbuktu, getting a huge amount of publicity in the States, particularly for the benefit of skeptical politicians in Congress and elsewhere. And US AFRICOM was duly created just after that. Part of this propaganda at the time was to change the name of the GSPC, which was far too long-winded to really get attention, and to recall it to Al-Qaeda. So we have the local so-called jihadists now being called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, ACME, before. So a rebranding of local terrorists to give the impression that this is all part of Al-Qaeda. And to top that off, if you like, kidnapping of Western hostages re-emerged again in 2008. It went on for about 3 years up until the Libyan crisis, and some 35 Westerners, mostly in the Sahel region, that part of Africa, were kidnapped. Most of them were eventually all released. One did actually die. But all of those kidnappings, everyone without exception, and I was heavily involved with many of them at the time, were all connected to the DRS infiltrated Al-Qaeda leaders. And this phase of the global war on terror lasted up until 2011. Mostly propaganda, some of these incidents, but it was very much for these American sort of motives. The third motive, I should say, was really residual. I shouldn't really call it a third motive, but of course, this vast geographic scene provided, it helped America sort of to globalize the idea of the war on terror beyond Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. So they could now talk of stretching across this vast waste of the Sahara, as they called it, you know, from the Indian Ocean across to the Atlantic Ocean and heading south. So that was a sort of third motive. All of that I've documented in two books. One was published in 2009 called The Dark Sahara, the second in 2013 called The Dying Sahara. Okay, so the third point I want to make is that relatively little real, if you like, terrorist action took place in that first phase of the GWOT, that is from 2002 up to 2011. Why was that? Well, the reason was, simply was because there was no terrorism in the region. The terrorists that were there were led by DRS infiltrated people. They were being led by the DRS. Therefore, all the incidents were either fabricated, some of them literally made up, in the way I've just described. Now, the problem for America here, and particularly for the local governments, particularly Mali and Niger, is to keep on board with the Americans, to get the American largesse, cash, arms, and whatever else Washington was handing out, not a great deal, but quite a lot for those countries, is that it hadn't got any terrorists, so it had to provoke them. And the way both Mali and Niger did this, with Algerian support, was to provoke unrest amongst Tuareg tribesmen. They're mostly nomadic Tuareg in the northern Saharan regions. And they deliberately provoked them into taking up arms. And then telling the Americans that these are terrorists. We've got terrorists here, look at them, these Tuareg people, and so forth. And I was in Washington at the time, actually briefing the State Department on this. Most extraordinary meetings, one of which was a woman called Emily Hunt, who was a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a fairly right-wing organization, who told the State Department that these were putative terrorists. A wonderful expression, uniquely sort of Washington of that era. So we have putative terrorists now running around all over the Sahara, notably the Tuareg. These Tuareg revolts lasted in 2004, 2005, 2007, and then more or less continuously through to 2010, 2011, with the overthrow of the Libyan regime. We now know that the US, the State Department, knew that the Mali government was lying over all this. We know that because WikiLeaks, bless their hearts, fortunately got their hands on over 400 documents, cables sent from Bamako to the State Department in Washington. So we know that those, and I've read all those documents, those cables, were basically saying that what the Mali government is saying is untrue. These aren't terrorists, these are Tuareg, they've got justifiable grievances and so on and so forth. So the Americans knew the real truth of what was going on in the area. So the fourth point, phase two of the war on terror, if you like, is really post the Libyan 2011 invasion, the ousting of Gaddafi. At the time of the planning of the invasion, this was in beginning of 2011, absolutely zero thought was given by the Americans, the British, and the France to the implications of that so-called NATO invasion. I was sitting on one of the key committees that was advising, so I listened to this and I heard it and I could not believe what I was listening to. There was absolutely zero thought of what might happen. And from that point on, or from after the Libyan invasion, after 2011, the American interest in the global war in the region began to wane. It diminished a bit, as it has done since. The reason for that is that Washington was pretty cross with Algeria because Algeria had double crossed them. It was helping Gaddafi. And that's not a wise thing to do to Washington. You're either an ally of them, or if you're going to double cross them, it's not necessarily wise. Uh, 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 so after that, we also have a situation where Obama had no clear policy on the region, nor of course did either Trump. He probably didn't even know where it was. And Biden doesn't seem to be much the wiser either. Also, at a more serious level, perhaps, the American oil energy crisis had now been effectively resolved. The region was no longer strategically essential to America's needs. US fracking, etc., was generating a huge amount of energy in America, and America had actually become a net exporter of energy. So Africa was no longer seen, as it was at the time of 9/11, as a national resource that needed to be secured. So from then on, we see Algeria, rather than America perhaps taking the leading role. Now, the immediate consequence of Gaddafi's overthrow is that Tuareg, in their hundreds, possibly thousands, returned from Libya to the Sahel, to northern Mali in particular. They were cross, they were angry, they were heavily armed, they were good fighters, and they joined up with the remnants of the few odd rebels who were still hanging around in the area after those provoked rebellions that I mentioned. And they formed a movement, the MNLA, Mouvement National pour la Libération de l'Azawad. Azawad is the Tuareg name for northern Mali. So they were going to free and make an independent state in northern Mali, so they thought. This worried Algeria hugely because the idea of irredentism in the region, Tuareg irredentism, would have spilt over into Algeria, caused a lot of trouble in Algeria. So strategically, Algeria had to try and cut off this inevitable movement. And it would have been inevitable because the Malian army was a waste of space, literally, and these rebels would have swept it away, as they did literally in a few weeks. So the Algerian strategy, very clever one, it was to discredit this movement, this MNLA, internationally, and to subsume it politically and militarily within an Islamist insurrection. And the way Algeria did this, bearing in mind it had already infiltrated these groups and more or less controlled them, was to create new, if you like, groups, new factions, new names, new brandings of Islamist groups in the area. In particular, an organization called Moujao, Movement for the Unification of Jihadism in West Africa, another group called Ansar al-Din, which was basically an extension of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, and Al-Qaeda itself, which was being run by the Algerian DRS. So the MNLA rebellion, it began in January 2012. It took over the whole of Azawad by April, May. Islamists more or less took over. We didn't hear much more about the Tuareg rebels. Sharia law came into force, a lot of atrocities, very much for the international media and attention, until by the beginning of January 2013, these Islamists were threatening Bamako itself. I should say they were being supplied from Algeria with fuel, foods, money, and all the rest of it. And France reacted. It had very little choice to step in and basically drive out these terrorists, or try to, from Mali. And that operation started in January 2013. And since then, we've seen the French strategy being one of military counterterrorism. It's been going on now for 8 years. It's failed absolutely dismally. All it's done is to encourage local jihadists to emerge and grow and join these forces. And France has now got about 5,000, just over 5,000 troops in the region, spread across what they call the G5S, that's the 5 Sahel countries. And during this period, as I said before, the US role has tended to diminish. Its role really has been restricted largely to surveillance and intelligence. There have been a few special forces in the region. They were 4 of them were killed, you may remember, in 2017 in an ambush that caused havoc in America. What have you got with troops in the region? Congress got very upset, and I don't think there are many more, if any, boots on the ground really left there. There are about 800 American forces left there. If you could have the next slide, please. They're basically in surveillance operations. The slide that's just come up is a huge air base. It's for drones. It's built in a place called Agadez, right in the desert. It's the largest foreign air base built by the American Air Force overseas. They have another base about 500 kilometers to the east, run by the CIA. Does rather spooky things. And if we could have the next slide, please. This shows the Reaper range of fire, if you like, of missile-loaded drones from that airbase. You can see it covers much of North Africa and the Sahel. If we could have the next slide following on, please. Next. This is a picture taken out of a window of American spy planes, Beechcraft, fitted with a lot of surveillance gear, sitting at Tamanrasset Airport. So that is really what the American role has been brought down to, providing intelligence, surveillance, and so forth, rather than boots on the ground. During this period, jihadist action has increased. It's spread right across the Sahel. It's gone down into West Africa. In the eastern side, Boko Haram has spread northwards into Niger and the Lake Chad basin area. And now the number of jihadists in the area, we don't know. I would estimate them at maybe 1,000, probably not more. The number of troops in the region, about 30,000, so a big disparity there. Those troops consist of nearly 18,000 UN peacekeepers, who are sitting ducks, I should say, for the jihadists, about 5,500 French troops, 5,000 G5S troops, that's from the local countries. They're easily brushed aside, not much of a fighting force, and about 2,000 multiple European units, mostly in so-called training operations. These statistics, as I said, about 5,000 innocent civilians have been killed, about 2 million displaced. I suspect it's more than that. Health and famine issues are rampant right throughout this area. Mali and Chad have both become military dictatorships, completely out of control, virtually. Failed states is a horrible word, but that's what they've become. And vast parts of this region are completely out of state control. I won't say in the hands of the jihadists, but certainly there for the taking and more or less under their largely control. Niger is struggling. It's doing a slightly better job. Burkina Faso is in pretty dire straits. And now, right now, in these last couple of months, as France is trying to withdraw from the area for domestic political reasons, it's basically a failed operation. Other powers are moving in like vultures. Russia is trying to move in at the moment through the Wagner Group. Turkey is trying to see what it can pick up in the area. Morocco, Israel, the Gulf states, they're all there. It's something of a nightmare region. China's taking economic advantage. Algeria may be intervening militarily. It's certainly playing a destabilizing role in the extreme. And during this period, from 2011 onwards, the United States, since the sort of Cheney-Rumsfeld era, when the war on terror was really at its height, in other words, during the Obama era, then under Trump and the Biden administrations, America's really had no clear policy on this crisis in the Sahel. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's just one final point I should say. One reason why the West, and Algeria in particular, doesn't want any sort of researchers, investigations going on in this part of the world is that the DRS, that's the Algerian intelligence services, with the complicity of the United States and the UK, established in about 2005 an Al-Qaeda, so-called Al-Qaeda training camp in the southern Sahara. And the slide that's just come up, if you can see it on the screen, there was a guy walking in the distance, that slide. In that area, this is in the mountains, in the deep south of Algeria, impenetrable country. You can see it there, you get lost behind all those rocks, and it goes on for hundreds of miles. In there is a training camp where they recruited terrorists, if you like, from all over the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. At any one time, there were about 280 being trained there in killing techniques and explosives and all the rest of it. The camp was there until about 2009. My estimate is that about 3,000 terrorists were trained through there. About 1,000 people were murdered in terms of as guinea pigs, being trained on how to have throat slit and all the rest of it. They were mostly taken out of the Algerian prisons. So the people who had been disappeared in the 1990s were now dragged out of prison and slaughtered down there. It took me 7 months when I knew where this base was to actually find it and to get proof of these bodies. There's an excavation of one that had been buried about 5 years when we found it with local touring. Now, the question is, these people, when they arrived, their IDs were taken, ocular recognitions, photographs, I presume DNA and all the rest of it, details flown up to Algiers, then on to London and Washington. And the question I just leave you with there is, was this a very clever counterterrorism operation, which may have stopped many major terrorist incidents during the first decade of the millennium, or was it a huge crime against humanity? I suspect it was both, and that is a moral, ethical point. The base was closed in about 2009. The occupants, the DRS so-called jihadists, moved south and then into Mali, and we see this movement south into Mali, and there we are. So if I could have slide 8, which is on the next slide, please. This was taken about 2 months ago, a little less, and it shows a convoy of Algerian tankers, fuel tankers, down near the Malian border, heading from north, going across the border, carrying fuel. What I don't know is, I know the guy who took the photograph, I don't know what that fuel was for. Was it to supply the jihadists? Was it to supply the French? Was it to supply possible new Algerian bases if they were going to move over the border? I don't know, but the picture is very real. I know where it was taken and who took it, and that gives you some idea of the dangers of what is going on in this region. So a couple of concluding points. The first is the US not only has no clear policy on what to do in the region, you might say for the whole of Africa as well, but it has also believed its own propaganda. All the American officials I've spoken to, there have been quite a few, they actually believe their own lies, which is not surprising when you see how these things are recorded. In other words, it has very little idea of what it has actually done, the damage, the catastrophe that it's caused in this part of Africa. It doesn't see a relationship between 9/11, the global war on terror, and the war on the Sahel as how it's developed now. The fact is that the GWOT has led to the total destabilization of much of the northern part of Africa. It's led to the deaths of thousands of civilians, and these are increasing literally daily as we speak, and the displacement of some 2 million people, possibly more, and that's getting worse. The second point is that through deliberate Algerian policy, and this is really what I've been able to see more in hindsight than that while it was going on, terrorism, formerly restricted to an estimated 600 extremists in northern Algeria, the GSPC, who were operative in the 1990s, have basically been shifted south as part of a deliberate strategy by the Algerian regime to shift these sort of troublemakers, if you like, jihadists, terrorists, just move them south, literally into the Sahel. And all of these operations I've described very briefly have added to that. And it's been a conscious policy from Algeria, with the DRS supplying them with foodstuffs, fuel, and so on and so forth. And of course, it's moving them further away from Europe, about 2,000 kilometers further south from the Mediterranean. And Europe, as far as it knows what's going on in the region, which is not a great deal because European intelligence is not the greatest in this part of the world, it has been more or less complicit with this whole idea of shifting terrorism south, or at least it sees it as a good outcome of what's happened in that sense. The third point, final point, this account, if you like, the truth, is the opposite of the official version, which is that the GWOT, the Global War on Terror, has been fighting a major terrorist incursion in the Sahara and the Sahel since 2002. In fact, this part of Africa, until that date, until 9/11, was one of complete tranquility. I know because I worked there, you could walk as far as your eye could see, as long as you could get water. It was absolutely safe as houses, totally safe for Westerners, tourists, anyone else almost, to travel wherever they desired. This was one of the great parts of the world you could literally go and you'd be totally safe apart from physical elements. The global war on terror has transformed this part of Africa into the most extensive war zone on the continent, with the potential and almost certainly to become very much worse. If the ninth slide will come up, is there a next slide? I think not. It's some references now, references which will be on the notes. Well, that's all I've got to say, and I thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeremy Keenan. Jeremy, I've actually, it's a fascinating and very compelling presentation which you've laid out. Certainly, this is a massive area of discussion. Your research is very deep and goes back a long way. Two questions. We'll try to keep it brief in the interest of time. The first is, you mentioned bin Laden earlier, and I wanted to ask your opinion on the infamous U.S. Embassy bombing in 1998 in Kenya, and also the Tanzanian bombing. And that was bin Laden's coming out party, if you will. And then the Clinton administration responded with the cruise missile strike on the pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, which is in the Sahel region. But that was that really set the tone for 9/11 in the sense that it introduced bin Laden as an avatar, as a protagonist for the global war on terror. And there are many that have alleged that these may have very well been a false flag type events. I just wanted to know if you had any view on that and that period, 1998.
Yeah. What I would say about it is, yes, that happened. Those events took place. Whether they were false flag operations, I don't know. I wasn't working in that area. It was not my sort of area in a sense. What I will say is that, yes, it did introduce the name of bin Laden into the mix, if you like, into the African mix. But the problem was from the energy crisis, which was the key driving thing behind the Bush administration before 9/11, from 1996 onwards, when America was becoming dependent on Africa for oil, the East Coast, which we just talked about, where those bombings took place, that was a long way from the oil. The area that the United States was looking at was particularly the Gulf area, Nigeria. They wanted Nigerian oil. And the East Coast is a very long way from the West Coast. So although those events took place, it was very difficult ideologically, if you like, to link them with what I've just described now. Hence the need to launch another war on terror, if you like, another front, one that covered and went down into Nigeria, North Africa, Algeria. So that these two regions, in a sense, ideologically speaking, were very far apart. And the thing that was keeping them apart was the oil, which is on the west there. So the question is a good question, but I've always seen them as fairly distinct. There's been very little linkage at any level between them. And the Americans never really made much of that, apart from, of course, dragging up the name of bin Laden. And the terrorist groups I've been talking about, the Bush administration at the time was referring to them as bin Laden's men in the Sahara. So they used the name bin Laden. Bin Laden had nothing to do with it at all. This part of the Sahara is a long way from Sudan, his chemical factory. It's a few thousand kilometers even further away from East Africa. So it's a good question, but I think I see them as being fairly separate, and there's never been much linkage, and there isn't now.
And secondly, you mentioned that when oil ceased to be a big priority for the United States in sense of securing the West African oil supply, but if you also U.S. AFRICOM at that time, China sort of appeared on the geopolitical radar of the United States as a kind of a big talking point. I certainly saw that in early AFRICOM documents. Chinese influence in Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, and particularly in South Sudan and Libya and a number of other countries. And so, do you think that do you think that is also a driving force for operations to, let's say, destabilize or keep a military presence in this part of Africa? What are your views on the Chinese question?
Well, I'm going to be fairly cynical to start with, and basically say that I don't really think that America has got any very clear idea of how to handle anything very much in Africa. Yes, it's aware of China moving in. It's aware of the fact that China economically certainly is taking over things that America could do, or American companies' investments could do probably much better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the nice thing about China is it doesn't have any political baggage. It doesn't really care if you're killing your own citizens. It just gets on with the job, builds the road or the railways, and you can do what you like. America, in spite of all we've been saying, does of course have certain ethical conditions and relating to investment, corruption and bribery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So America is really losing out heavily in that sense of investments into Africa in general. Uh, and this is why it's keeping, as far as it can, an eye on what is going on. Its contribution now to what we've just been talking about is very much through its drone reconnaissance, boots on the ground. As far as I'm aware, there are no American fighting troops, that is, special forces on the ground. There may be 2 or 3 here and there, a couple of getting Marines guarding the embassy, and there'll be a few guarding the air base, etc. There are about 800 troops there, but they're pretty well all tied to the air bases, to the drone reconnaissance, as far as I'm aware, and I think I'm 99% correct on that. There is the CIA base, has probably got a few there. So I think it's really now watching what's going on in the continent with this, as far as State Department is concerned, great uncertainty as to really what to do. And I think what is happening in the Sahel now, the war I'm talking about, this is very worrying for America because the situation there now is really pretty much out of control. Well, not far off, and it's threatening right down to the coast, Cote d'Ivoire, and down to the coastal cities. All sorts of things could happen. I wouldn't like to predict. What America doesn't see is how all of this problem it's got now started from its own war on terror, its own false flag operations, and so forth. When you take an area that big, and there are about 10 million people live in the Sahara, so there's a lot of people live there, and most of their livelihoods have been put at risk. They've been stopped by all this. Tourism, which was a huge industry for much of the people in the Sahara, the desert nomads, driving, take camel rides, all this sort of stuff, importing quite a lot of income and so forth, it's all come to a stop. What do these people do? They get fed up. They don't die. They become drug traffickers, all sorts of things. They've got to make a living. So the whole process of if you like, implanting, you might say, a fake war on terror, because there wasn't much terrorism going on to begin with. If we take the big bomb blast, the big blast at the Algerian gas facility in 2013, that was done by the DRS. That was a false flag operation that went catastrophically wrong. But it's not genuine terrorism. This was a fabricated operation, and it went wrong disastrously. So 40 odd Westerners were killed, 88 people altogether, killed 82 people altogether. So I think the problem is that America has been telling so many lies through AFRICOM, through the Pentagon, through the State Department, through the rest of it, through the administrations. They don't really have a good understanding of what they've done in America, in Africa over the last 20 years. They can't see how this situation has stemmed from what they created in 2001-2. And I get that from briefings that I have with certain levels of American officialdom. We can talk very friendly, in a friendly manner about this, and they really don't believe it. They don't know, and they say, gosh, did that happen? And if you think that, taking any town in that Sahel region, Timbuktu or Gao, anywhere, you had, say, a small American contingent there, maybe a platoon or something headed by a captain, or maybe not much higher in rank. That command changes every 6 months. Well, we've gone nearly 20 years. So every 6 months, the command is changing. No one's going to write down and say, by the way, if you take over from me, we told this lie, we did this wasn't true, that was fabricated. There's no record of this stuff. Those WikiLeaks documents, they've been shredded, they've been disappeared. There were codes on them. And all those that didn't refer particularly to the borders were literally dustbined and thrown out. So if you were talking to an advisor to the State Department now, and you were to recount this to them, I think they would probably say, they would say, gosh, I can't believe that. At the time we thought this, we were doing this. And I said, sure you were, but you were using false information, which was your own lies. You were believing your own propaganda. And that, I think, is the problem America's had. And certainly it's got it now. And even though we've moved on 20 years, but the mess has just got greater. And the starting point, of where this mess came from is very clear.
I think that's a great point you've made. And there's a lot of talk, and we discuss a lot about how the effect of propaganda on the general public, but there's not a lot of discussion, or people aren't aware of just to the degree which people working within the state apparatuses are marinated in their own propaganda, and how that affects how they're doing their jobs from day to day, and the decisions that they're making, which is a really interesting discussion. That's a good segue for a future discussion as well. But I want to thank you, Professor Jeremy Keenan, for a fantastic presentation. And I do encourage people again to go look at the reference notes, which will be available after below the video player that Jeremy will be providing for us. Thank you very much.